everyone. We're really happy that you joined us here today for this great webinar. My name is Joanna Salinas. I am the Outreach Coordinator with the Waukesha County Green Team. If you are unfamiliar with us, we are a volunteer-based nonprofit 501c3 organization, and we are focused on promoting environmental and economic sustainability in Waukesha County through education, collaboration, and local action. So to do that, we work with residents, businesses, schools, municipalities, and organizations. And we're really excited to gather all of you here this afternoon for this great presentation by Julia Robson. So this webinar is part of our Municipal Guide to Sustainable Planning, which is a tool we developed to assist communities with incorporating actionable elements of sustainability into your ongoing processes and municipal business planning. So today we are very excited to welcome Julia Robson, who is the Natural Resource Program Coordinator for the Waukesha County Park System. So I was excited to learn about Julia that she was honored with the Southeastern Wisconsin Invasive Species Consortium, that's a mouthful, their Sweat Equity Award for individuals with exceptional hands-on commitment to invasive species management. And then the next year, Waukesha County was awarded the DNR's Invasive Species Action Award for their efforts in invasive species management, which Julia, I know you played a key role in all of that. So welcome, and I will pass it over to you.
All right, thank you, Joanna. Thank you for having me. Let me just get my screen shared. All right, Joanna, can you just confirm that we look good on your end?
Looks great.
Okay, great. All right, well, thank you for joining us this afternoon, everyone, to talk about this topic. I was telling Joanna that this could basically be a week-long course on this topic, but we will condense it to very high level for an hour here over lunch today. And my goal is to make as many resources known to you as possible throughout the course of this. And also I have my contact information at the end of this so that you're more than welcome to reach out with species specific questions or just questions in general about invasive species management, should you have them and they not be answered over the course of the presentation this afternoon. So here we go. So very briefly, a little bit about Waukesha County Parks and land use and how it relates to this topic. We are a natural resource-based park system with over 8,500 acres of land in Waukesha County. Being natural resource-based, a majority of our parks are predominantly natural areas ranging from oak woodlands to oak savannas and prairies. So essentially what that means is less mowed turf acreage and more natural areas, which is great for supporting native biodiversity, but also creates a lot of room for invasive species to establish and creates a lot of management and stewardship work requirements on our end. So we do actively manage over 1,200 acres of our natural areas every year with a restoration focus in mind. And at the center of most of our restoration goals is invasive species management and mitigating invasive species in our green spaces. And right now we actively manage 37 of what is about 128 of the regulated invasive species in the state of Wisconsin. 37 of them we actively manage every year in our park system. So it's kind of our bread and butter. So this afternoon, I'll just high level go over invasive species, what's being done on the national, state, and local levels. I will talk about some species that are important to know, particularly this time of year, some of which you probably do see in your local green spaces. Others are ones that are a really high priority for us to keep our eyes out for because they're not well established in our region yet. Again, there's over 120 plus of these. I don't have time to cover every single one, but I'll give you the resources to look into additional species should you want to and make myself available for questions. We'll also talk about, again, high level, some control strategies and how you can get involved in helping with invasive species management. So invasive species, that term wasn't really defined at a national level until the late 90s, actually, when an executive order was passed to establish the Invasive Species Council at a federal level. And as part of that process, we formally defined invasive species as being non-native species to an ecosystem, i.e. they didn't involve in that ecosystem with the native species, and species that would be likely, whose introduction would be likely to cause economic harm, environmental harm, or harm to human health. So it's not just, I'll say it here, the term weed and invasive species aren't an interchangeable thing, right? We can have weedy species that are an annoyance. Even native species can be weedy, like goldenrods, for example, but an invasive species has to meet, fall with under this definition or category. It's also important to note that invasive species can be native to certain regions of the United States or North America, but be invasive within your particular region that you maybe live or work. So a good example of this is the red swamp crayfish. It's native to the southern US in that orange area highlighted here on the map, but everywhere in those red zones is where it's been introduced and has become severely invasive. So it's not necessarily a species that has to come from some far-reaching part of the globe to our region. It can literally be a species that may occur somewhere else within North America, and it can still become invasive within our region. The spread of invasive species really was and has been facilitated by international commerce, our ability to move things from different regions of the globe. A good example of this is emerald ash borer, which most of us are familiar with, especially if we live in this region, work in this region. This small wood-boring beetle has decimated millions of ash trees in our region, and this particular species made its way over into the US in the early 2000s through packing material in shipping crates. So unintentional introduction, but again, it was that ability to move goods around that facilitated its introduction. So we've got about 50,000 non-native species within the US, but I mean, that includes things that we grow as crops, that includes domesticated livestock. So not everything that's not native becomes an invasive species, right? In fact, only a small fraction of species that are transported actually become established as pest or invasive species. Just about 1% actually do. There's a lot of things that have to kind of align for a species to become invasive within an introduced region, and we'll talk about that. But to date, many countries actually have over 20% or more of alien species in their floras. So there's a lot of movement occurring, a lot of establishment occurring across the globe of species outside of their native ranges. When we look at what types of species and their introduction, the native ranges of the species that are introduced to our region that become invasive, a lot of them, when you look it up, it'll say Eurasian. So they're native to Europe or Asia. And it does make sense when you look at the world climate regions maps. You look at the climatic conditions within Europe and Asia, and then you look to North America, particularly in the Midwest. We have very similar climatic conditions, which means similar growing conditions to what these species would experience in their native ranges. So they're kind of set up for success from the get-go because of where they originated from and the climate there. With that, then a lot of these species that we have on the landscape that are considered invasive species have a lot of what we call mechanisms for success that also then give them more of an advantage over our native species, leading to them outcompeting those native species and becoming invasive. One of them is the phenological advantages that they have over our native species. That picture on the bottom left there, that's at Fox River Park. That's buckthorn in the fall. So this is a work day that we had in late October, early November, but you can see all of that greenery. That's all European or common buckthorn there in the understory. So many of our non-native species tend to be the first species to leaf out in the spring and the last to lose their leaves in fall. Makes them easy to pinpoint and ID. But it also means that they are taking up resources from the soil, utilizing sunlight, any resources that our native plants would need to grow and compete well. These species are already doing it the first in the year and the last to be doing it at the end of the season too. They exhibit rapid growth and reproduction as well. So many invasive species that we manage tend to produce a lot of seed, have high germination rates of seed, and they grow quickly. And this is characteristic of some native species too. Invasives also tend to have high dispersal ability. So whether that's they're wind dispersed easily, or there's something like common burdock, which is pictured on the right, that you've probably gotten them on your own socks when you're hiking or seen them caught up on your pet. But they disperse readily. And the key here is all of these advantages, plus the fact that they have no natural predators within their introduced range, is what really allows them to flourish within an introduced area. They don't have the same pressures from herbivores or insects or fungi or pathogens that maybe keep their populations in check in their native range. They're outside of that range, introduced in a new area where those things don't exist. So the system of checks and balances is not there. And then lastly, most of the invasive species we manage, unfortunately, were intentional introductions. So they were plants that we brought here and we used them for some purpose, and then they escaped and became invasive from that setting. So kudzu, it's called the vine that ate the South, quite literally. That vine was escaped from an ornamental plant exposition, I believe back in the late 1800s. Japanese barberry, pictured there in the middle, commonly used in landscape plantings. That's been a woody shrub that's escaped and now is an invasive plant pest within our woodlands. And then reed canary grass all the way on the right. You ask many land managers what's one of the worst aquatic invasive species they have to work with. Reed canary grass is probably on there. That was intentionally introduced for erosion control purposes and now is a real hazard within wetland ecosystems. And we care about this because there's a lot of negative impacts from invasive species. They displace native species by outcompeting them. Then, because of that, they've thereby reduced the and degraded wildlife habitat that's available. You think about our native ecosystems with the diversity of plants that support a diversity of insects that then our birds can feed on. The ecosystem cannot support the same level of biodiversity when it's a complete monoculture of an invasive species compared to a diverse native ecosystem. Invasives can alter ecosystem processes. So Phragmites or giant reedgrass, pictured on the upper left there, and reed canary grass falls in this category too. They can completely alter the hydrology in wetlands that they become established in. They have significant economic impacts associated with them as well. Property values are noted to decrease when invasive species are heavily present on a property. Aesthetics, it just changes the whole aesthetic of our parklands too. If you're hiking through a diverse prairie that then becomes infested with autumn olive or honeysuckle and it's just a wall of brush, it's just not even the same experience, even if you don't know what you're looking at. And then lastly, threats to human health. Wild parsnip, pictured on the bottom right there, is one of those species where if you come into contact with it, the oils can cause a severe reaction, sun blistering on your skin. So those are just some of the high level reasons that we care about invasives and the impacts that they cause. And in some situations, invasive species, particular species, can become such a problem that we just see vast landscapes that have completely degraded into monocultures of one particular species. Many of us have probably gone for a hike in the spring in the woods and seen areas pictured in the upper left there that are just pure stands of garlic mustard in the understory, which would have once been maybe a carpet of spring ephemeral wildflowers. So much so that 42% of species that are listed as threatened or endangered on the endangered species list are listed in part because of the impacts of invasive species on that particular species habitat or it directly. And even a 2021 study estimated that invasive species have cost North America $2 billion per year since the early 1960s. So this is not just in removal efforts, but also mitigating impacts from, say, zebra or quagga mussels plugging water intake pipes. So they're extremely costly to manage and even mitigate. And the problem is, unfortunately, just exacerbated by other environmental issues that we face today, such as climate change. Here's the updated plant hardiness zone map based on low average winter temperatures. And we are just continuing to get milder winters, warmer winters, which unfortunately for us will mean that invasives that maybe were held at bay due to hard and long winter freezes now have more opportunity to become established within our region. All right, so that was the bad news. That was the doomsday portion of the whole program. So on the positive, the forward-thinking action part of this, what are we doing about it? So at the national level, as I mentioned, when the executive order was passed in the late 90s, the National Invasive Species Council was established. And the goal of this council is to provide high-level vision and leadership that's necessary to sustain and expand federal efforts to basically prevent and eradicate and control invasive species on the landscape. At the state level, so drilling down a little further, we actually do have, the Wisconsin DNR has an invasive species rule, often referred to as NR 40. So NR 40 categorizes all of the invasive species within the state as either restricted or prohibited species. So restricted species are often the species that have become established within the state. So there's really no realistic world where we're able to eradicate them. They're on the landscape, but the goal is just to kind of manage them at levels where native species can still compete with them. And then we have prohibited species. Prohibited species are those that perhaps have they've only been minorly introduced to the state, eradication is possible, or they have not even been established in the state. We're just kind of, they're on our radar and they're absolutely prohibited from making their way here. But with prohibited species, if they are encountered, it can be enforced. Removal and control can be enforced by the state for prohibited species only. Control of restricted species is encouraged, but it's not necessarily required. So we'll talk about a few of those in a minute. Then drilling down further from the state level, on the local scale within southeastern Wisconsin, we have a cooperative weed management area called SEWISC. So Southeastern Wisconsin Invasive Species Consortium, but they essentially promote management and education and support that work related to invasive species throughout the 8-county southeastern region. So they support our region by providing grants, by providing information on invasive species, control methods and techniques. They support outreach efforts. And as I mentioned before, their website is a great resource for anyone that's looking to learn more about what's new invaders in the region, what's being done, as well as if you're looking for control information. They're a great guidance resource for you. Okay, so some species to watch out for here in southeastern Wisconsin. Prior to diving into some of that, I just want to provide a couple high-level definitions because I may refer to some of these terms throughout the presentation. So life history-wise with our plants, we've got plants that we consider to be annuals, biennials, and perennials. So annual plants will complete their life cycle from being a seed to a flower that produces seed all in one growing season. So when that happens, when that plant has gone to flower, produce seed, that individual plant will then die each year. And those seeds that it produced will create the following year's plants. So those are annual plants. Biennials require 2 years to complete that life cycle. So in the first year, they may be a small rosette. Garlic mustard is an example of a biennial. So in the first year, it's a rosette plant. And then second year, it produces a stem from which it produces flowers and eventually seed formation, followed by that plant dying after it sets seed. And then perennials, which are going to be the most stubborn of plants to manage, those are plants that will survive for many growing seasons. So think of something like a Canada thistle, or maybe a woody, like a buckthorn. That is a perennial plant. They survive for many growing seasons. The top portion of those plants will die back each winter, but it regrows from the same roots that following spring. And I go into these definitions because as you look into control information for a lot of invasives, you need to understand what life cycle they have in order to plan effective management for them. This one shouldn't be a stranger to anybody. So Canada thistle, right now, I'm putting this one up right now too because it's in full bloom. So it's a great time to do control on it. But Canada thistle is a really aggressive perennial invasive species with a very vigorous root system. So because it has a vigorous root system, unfortunately, pulling is never the most effective option. Hand pulling isn't the most effective option for Canada thistle. It's also one to watch out for if you're doing new rain garden installations or prairie plantings. Canada thistle early on, and it likes to invade newly established or planted areas. And it's definitely one, because it's a perennial, that you want to keep your eye on and control early if you're working to establish native plantings. It is considered a noxious weed as well as an invasive. So noxious weed is like a subset ranking after invasive. So municipalities or local entities, government bodies can basically designate plant species as noxious weeds in addition to being invasive species. And that just can essentially mean that you're required to control something because it's designated as a noxious weed. Because as you can see, based on the little icon on the upper right there, it is just a restricted species by the Wisconsin DNR. So control by the state isn't required, but if your local municipality has it registered as a noxious weed, it can be required that you have to control it. So controlling it, there's some pretty effective control methods for Canada thistle. That's the good news. We do a lot of thistle management in our prairie areas and park use areas. So one of the most effective means of controlling it is with the use of herbicides. So foliar spraying with either milestone or glyphosate. Milestone is a broadleaf specific herbicide that we utilize most often on Canada thistle and see very good results. So being broadleaf specific means it should not impact the grasses or sedges that it may be growing with. It also has a pre-emergence capability to it, so it will kind of affect the Canada thistle seed that would be in the seed bed too. So it's very effective for Canada thistle control. You can also use glyphosate. If herbicides are not something that you want to use, or say you don't have the time, if the thistle is already going to seed, there's really no point right now in spraying it. Or excuse me, if you know you're not going to have the time to spray it before it goes to seed, you can cut it or mow it when it's at bud or in flower. And if it's a small infestation area or isolated plants and you just want to repeatedly cut something, you can stress out a perennial plant enough to the point with repeated cuttings at flowers where it eventually will give up. It will exhaust all of its root reserves, excuse me. But if you're managing thistle on a scale, for example, like we are, going out and cutting each individual plant repeatedly is just not feasible. And that's why either large scale mowing or the use of herbicides is the most effective means for eradication. Do not mow it if the seeds have already developed. So when it's got the white tufts, don't bother mowing it. You're just going to spread it further. Those seedlings will emerge as rosettes in fall or early spring though. So you can do Canada thistle control late in the year on those first year plants. So you get another window later into the year where you can do some active control on it, which is nice. And you can spray Canada thistle until temperatures, even at 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Other plants will have gone dormant at that point, but you can still get a good kill on Canada thistle using milestone late into the season, which we've done that before too. Wild parsnip. I added this one because right now this is in full bloom all along our roadsides. You can't miss it, unfortunately. So this is an invasive member of the parsley family. So it's carrot. It's a biennial. Biennials, if you have an invasive that you're dealing with that's a biennial, I almost look at that as like, oh, there's definitely some hope because invasive biennials can be managed pretty effectively through mowing, properly timed mowing. Wild parsnip has a long, thick taproot, which you can cut manually if you don't want to use chemicals. I already mentioned how this plant contains chemicals that increase skin sensitivity to sun. The leaves, as you can see on the top right there, consist of 2 to 5 pairs of leaflets within the leaf. The flowers bloom June and July. It's a yellow umbel, as you can kind of see in the pictures here. The seeds of this plant are very easily carried by wind, water, and spread by equipment. So unfortunately, a lot of the parsnip that you see spreading in our roadways, unfortunately, the spread of that has been facilitated by mowing it when it's at seed. So we're just spreading it while we do right-of-way mowing. We can be controlling it with properly timed mowing though. Foliar spraying it, we have utilized glyphosate on this. There's a new herbicide that'll be coming out that's been found to be very specific and effective on wild parsnip called SiteView, and I thought they were making that available this summer. I haven't seen anything available by the 2.5 gallon jug yet, but there've been very promising results with that. So that can be sprayed late spring when it's a rosette, or before flowering if it's a second year plant. But in small infestations, like I mentioned before, you can control it by just cutting it. We use something called a parsnip predator, or just take a shovel and you sever the root about an inch or two below the soil, and you can effectively eradicate a population of wild parsnip manually, just like that. Even a large patch, if you mow it before the seeds have developed, and you do that repeatedly over the course of a couple years, you can effectively suppress that population, particularly because they're biennial plants. The other one that goes hand in hand with wild parsnip is common teasel and cut-leafed teasel. So you'll see this growing in the roadways. Very similar life cycle. So it's a monocarpic perennial, but basically this plant can be controlled side by side with wild parsnip. They bloom in a very similar time period in the summer. They grow in just about the same areas, and we're also unfortunately facilitating its spread with improperly timed mowing. And so this one is one to just keep your eye out for and control in the same way. You can cut the taproot of this plant, mow it at the same time, and get the similar control results on teasel as you would the wild parsnip as well. Japanese knotweed, this is one, depending on what region you are in the state, it's not super prevalent. There's some bad infestations of it in Waukesha County, but it's not as common as, say, the wild parsnip or the teasel is. It's going to bloom in August. It's not blooming yet, but it's an upright, semi-woody, shrub-like herbaceous plant. It kind of looks like bamboo, but it's actually in the buckwheat family. It can get really big, up to 10 feet tall for Japanese knotweed and 15 for giant knotweed. Leaves are really, really unique looking. As you can see, they're almost spade shaped with a flat bottom where that petiole meets the leaf. And they alternate down the stem. This will grow and really, it's more of a woodland and edge invasive, but you can get it in rights of ways too. So it grows just about anywhere, it seems like. But reproduction can occur both vegetatively through rhizomes and seeds. So it's very hard to eradicate when you start working on it. And because it can grow vegetatively, when you're working on it, and that basically means that a node of this plant or a joint, like look in the upper right picture there, a node from that plant can break off and establish a brand new plant elsewhere. So you have to be very conscientious when you're controlling this plant of cleaning equipment and ensuring that you're managing the waste and the debris that you're creating from this removal effort so that you're not spreading it inadvertently elsewhere. So here are some other photos where you can kind of get an idea of scale of this plant. And this is in August when it's in bloom. Highest priority for controlling knotweed should be if it's occurring near areas where it's established along water, which most of these pictures are from sites where it has. Because again, like I said, the way this can spread vegetatively, a piece of this plant gets in a waterway, it just goes downstream and establishes a whole new infestation. Controlling it's really difficult. So you really have to stress its root reserves. This is a plant that can grow up to 3 inches per day in summer. So it's extremely vigorous. Its roots can go 30 feet down, 60 feet out. It's just very, very robust. So one of the best and most effective ways to control it is through repeated cutting. So what we do is we'll come in and we'll cut a patch of knotweed twice. So we're stressing the plant's root system. And then after that cutting, 2 to 3 cuttings within the growing season, we'll come in and use a foliar applicant of herbicide on it. So the plant is as stressed as we can get it within the growing season. And then we use a systemic herbicide on it that the plant will take down into its roots and effectively kill itself. It's a perennial plant. So again, that's with perennials, you can expect to be having to invest a bit more intensive control options. But we'll utilize things such as glyphosate, triclopyr, so broadleaf specific herbicides, imazapyr, and imidacloprid is also effective on it too. You can do cut stemming or cut stumping on it. So if you have only a few plants, you can just individually cut and almost dab and treat the stem with chemical, and that's been effective. It's just important to be sure to use a surfactant when you're spraying this plant because it's got very waxy leaves, and I'll talk a little bit about surfactants in a minute. Fun fact, you can make a rhubarb out of this, apparently. I didn't know that. I've never tried it, but any reason I can give people to go out and get rid of knotweed would be great. So if you're cutting it to eventually control it and you want to make use of your cuttings, maybe consider making some rhubarb. Couple familiar ones I would assume to most people. Honeysuckle and buckthorn are up next. So honeysuckle is an invasive woodland understory shrub. It's a deciduous shrub. It can get up to 15 feet tall, so it can be a really robust plant. The leaves are opposite of one another along the stem. They're kind of elliptical or oblong, and they come to a very sharp point at the end. The flowers are extremely fragrant, so a lot of people do enjoy them. And you do see the pollinators kind of visiting them as well. And then it produces really bright fruit in a cluster, like 2 to 4 fruits at the end of every year. It does have a shallow and very fibrous root system. So for smaller, younger honeysuckles, you can effectively pull it. You just have to be aware of how much soil disturbance you're causing. But if they're young plants, you can effectively pull them out to eradicate them. So it's something to keep in mind, again, if you're wanting to avoid using intensive manual control efforts or avoid chemical in some situations. But one thing to note is if you are using herbicides to control honeysuckle, which often you're going to need to effectively eradicate it, the triclopirs or the broadleaf specific herbicides like Garlon that you would use on it are not as effective as they are on buckthorn. So with honeysuckle, when we're coming in and managing that, we're using glyphosate when we're controlling honeysuckle because it's shown better effectiveness, and not using triclopyr on honeysuckle. So something that's come out from the research over the years that we've also noticed. Hand in hand with honeysuckle is common buckthorn. It's more of a tall understory shrub or understory tree, I would be more apt to call it. We're all pretty familiar with buckthorn, that false thorn, the buds, the brown buds that lay nice and cleanly against the stem, round dark green leaves, those dark blue berries, almost black berries at the end of the year. Not a species that you're likely going to eradicate at all from the region, but you can manage it to a level where native species can compete with it. Usually what we recommend is if you've got a site, most areas where people are dealing with buckthorn, they say, oh, I have so much, I don't even know where to start. One thing I recommend is usually targeting the female trees. They are dioecious, so the female trees will produce berries in fall, and they'll hold those berries over winter often because wildlife don't prefer to eat them until they have to. And if they are eating them, it does actually make them sick. But the female trees will have those berries. And so if you can start with controlling and removing any berry producing buckthorns on your property, that's a great first step because then you're removing the basically trees that are reproducing and producing the seed that leads to more buckthorn on the property or within the area. So start there, at least with berry producing buckthorns if you can. Black swallowwort. So we're going to talk about one of my biggest nemesis, black swallowwort. It's a vine. And this species, you can see it's prohibited in most of Wisconsin. Unfortunately, it's become established in the southern portion of the state. We manage a very aggressive infestation of it at our McGuanago Park currently. But it's a vine that will actively twine around grasses, around trees. It also likes to grow in almost any growing medium. I've seen it in deep shade. I've seen it working its way out into our prairie units. You name it, it seems to grow just about anywhere. And it can form very, very dense blankets of this vine. And vines are notoriously difficult to control because of their climbing capability. So when you're using chemical to control them, it's difficult because they're growing over desirable native vegetation that you don't want to be impacted by your control methods. So the best thing you can do is just prevent invasive vines like this from even becoming established on your property and doing early control if you do find them. They are in the milkweed family, so they do produce these slender seed pods that look like milkweed. That's the bottom picture. The upper picture on the left is the bloom. So it blooms in June, starts in June really. So we're kind of probably into the seed pod forming portion of its phenology, but the flowers are these really gothic looking milkweed flowers. It's quite beautiful, honestly. And the leaves are the very, very waxy, shiny, dark green, almost teardrop shaped bloom. Here you can see some pictures of what I mean about it twining and winding up some grasses. On the bottom picture, that's after it's gone to seed, but you can see all of those little seed pods there. Control is possible. You can do, if it's small, a couple plants, you can just cut them at the stem and treat the stem with the glyphosate. Otherwise, if you have a large infestation, foliar spraying with either triclopyr, so a Garlon, or glyphosate mixed with a surfactant can be effective as well. If you're desperate and you missed all the spraying time frames and you see some black swallowwort that has pods, pull and bag the pods off of it and dispose of the pods too. Just not allowing it to produce seed can be effective as well. A fully prohibited relative of the black swallowwort is the pale swallowwort. So this has not been documented yet to my knowledge in Wisconsin, which is why it's prohibited. The pale swallowwort looks very similar to black swallowwort with the exception of the flowers being this pale pink versus that dark maroon color. So keep your eye out for this species since we obviously have black swallowwort established in the region. Big problem with the swallowworts, I mentioned that they're in the milkweed family, and being that they're in the milkweed family, monarchs do actually lay eggs on them, but unfortunately, black swallowwort and pale swallowwort, they are toxic to monarch larvae. So it's a population trap in a sense. They will egg lay, just identifying it as a milkweed as one of their host plants, and the young will not survive on those plants. Caterpillars will perish feeding on the swallowwort plants. So it's even more of an impetus for really wanting to make sure that these are not species that get well established within our region because it will grow side by side with milkweed. Moving on to a couple species that I still see, or, I've seen even they were planted in our parks and landscaping back in the day. So we're working on eradicating them and phasing them out because they've become invasive in natural areas. Japanese barberry, I mentioned that was an ornamental plant that's widely used, still unfortunately widely used today. It's a restricted species. But this, as an ornamental shrub, it's a cool looking shrub. It's got these whorled leaves that all whirl around the stem, and then the flowers dangle from that point as well, which eventually form those beautiful little red berries. Unfortunately, the birds love the berries and the birds spread the berries. So they feed on the berries and those get dropped, deposited within our natural areas. And barberry has become a very aggressive understory woodland invasive species. In Menominee Park, up in Menominee Falls, we have to actively manage this every year. It's one of our highest quality woodlands, but this is a problem invasive in the understory, forming just huge dense thickets. That photo that's on the upper right there, that's what it's looks like when it becomes invasive in a woodland understory. It's not this cute little, boxy, beautiful shrub that's manicured in a landscape. They become really gnarly to work with and difficult to control. And if you're ever unsure, the roots and the cambium of barberry, you scrape it, you get this bright orange color. So that's kind of a good giveaway in the fall if you're out looking for it to control it. If it doesn't have those berries persisting on it, you can just scrape the bark a little bit and you should get that bright yellow coloration to it as well. And this can be effectively controlled through cut stumping. So cutting it down to almost just a couple inches above the soil, and then treating the stump with something like a glyphosate or a triclopyr is also effective. Winged burning bush is another one that's become highly aggressive and invasive in natural areas that was and still is kind of favored within the landscaping world. So winged burning bush is it's got those unique little fruit capsules that contain up to 4 seeds with like the red, orange, fleshy tissues around them. So these very interesting capsules. And the stems are the giveaway. You get this corking or this winging along the stem, particularly the new growth on the tree, and that's distinct to winged burning bush. We have native species of euonymus, but the winged burning bush is the aggressive, non-native, invasive species that we have to manage. It's a prolific seed producer, so it makes a lot of seed that are spread again readily by birds. And it's not super palatable to white-tailed deer. So even when it does get into our natural areas, you don't see the deer preferring it at all. So here's some photos just to give you some context of what it looks like fall woodland understory where invasive winged burning bush has taken hold. It's a monoculture that has effectively outcompeted native species in here. So do not promote it. It is a beautiful fall color, but we have a lot of native species that will give a pink fall color to encourage your neighbors or anybody to use in plantings. Controlling it, you can effectively controlling it by cut stumping it. So cutting it, treating the stump. You can foliar spray it. We've had mixed results with that. And then it does easily hand pull when it's young as well. And prescribed fire, it does not like to be burned. So if you're managing oak woodland, any woodland really in our region, likely evolve with fire, except for a few areas, maybe closer to the coast on the Great Lakes coast there. Fire is an effective and appropriate process to reintroduce into these areas, which will help with control. Calorie pear is another one I'll mention. Again, one that was used widely in landscaping and residential areas, and just mixed use areas. This has been a tree that's in the last 10 years, we've just been noticing it escaping, right? So it's showing up in highway rights of ways and stormwater detention ponds. And a lot of these pictures here, the one on the right in particular, in the foreground is a calorie pear that you can tell it's mulched around, it was intentionally planted. And then in the basin to the right of it, you can see small trees with the same leaves that are the color of the calorie pear in the foreground in the background there. And that's because it's just seed setting. It's proliferating on its own. And we're seeing a lot of this. So it's becoming more and more of an issue in our region. And they're actually considering it for designation under NR40 as well. So remove them if you have them and you can. And if you have a natural area that's become infested with them, you can definitely want to be on top of controlling it before they get established. Just touch on a couple quick wetland invasives here. So purple loosestrife is one that's restricted in our state. Many would say it's beautiful. It kind of is. I can't disagree with that, but it's a wetland perennial with up to 50 stems topped with purple flower spikes. So this thing produces tens of thousands of seeds per plant with really high seed viability. So each mature plant can produce up to 2 million seeds that are viable in the soil for at least 7 years. So if you allow purple loosestrife to become well established in an area, it will persist for a long time. So control is kind of very important. Here's some more images of what it looks like. There's some natives that you may mistake for this, things like blue vervain grows in similar conditions to purple loosestrife, but purple loosestrife is a much more robust plant than our native blue vervain. The good news is we actually have an interesting biocontrol agent for purple loosestrife. They're called Galarusella beetles. So this was something that was heavily researched and vetted by the state for many years before it became an accepted method of control. But we participate in this program. We actually raise Galarusella beetles, our volunteers do, in nursery pools, which is pictured in the center here. We raise the beetles over the course of early summer, and then we take those beetles and release them out into parks and greenway areas that have lots of purple loosestrife. And the beetles will essentially browse the plants to a point where the plants are so stressed that they do not flower and they do not produce seed. So while the beetles won't exactly eradicate the purple loosestrife, what they will do is they'll prevent them from setting the 100,000 plus seeds that they typically would if they weren't experiencing that predation pressure from the beetle. So it's a great option if you have a large area, a large infestation, or again, if you don't, chemicals are not one of the tools that you're going to use in the toolbox. We have a very effective biocontrol agent for large purple loosestrife infestations. A prohibited one here to really keep your eye out for, Sheboygan had a couple noted infestations of this, is giant hogweed, not to be confused with our native cow parsnip. Giant hogweed is significantly larger and the leaves are significantly more cut than the native cow parsnip is. So compound palmate leaf, so the leaf looks palmate, like kind of a palm with deep lobes. Think of the lobes as in between my fingers here. That's what the plant is. It can get about 8 to 20 feet tall when it's in flower. It's got extremely hollow and rigid stems to it, large white umbel flowers, but much more robust than native cow parsnip and highly aggressive. So these plants produce about 20,000 seeds per seed head with a germination rate of 50%. So if it sets seed, it's likely to produce, 10,000 of those seeds are likely to become another plant. It is extremely irritating to the skin. So control, you'll have to think about that when you're doing control. Small populations can be hand dug, or you can control it similar to how I was describing for wild parsnip, kind of cutting that root. But keep an eye out for that. Okay, so high-level control methods and strategies. With invasive species, what you will learn is it's just never going to be one thing, and it's never going to be one season. It's if you're going to control an invasive species, prioritize which ones you want to focus on, and then come up with your control plan, because it's likely going to involve, as you've probably gotten from some of what I've been saying, multiple methods. We do everything from mowing to hand cutting, pulling, burning, the use of herbicide. Prescribed grazing is also an option, as well as biocontrol. So when we prioritize doing control efforts, so we've got a huge park system, and this is what we have to go through every year. It's not just one property we're working on. We've got land spread out over the entire county. If we're looking at controlling an invasive species in a park, it may be instinct to just go for where things seem the worst. Like, okay, where is all this knotweed coming from? Oh, there's a huge patch here. We have a huge patch at the center, but then there's all these outlying infestations, these outlier plants. You may be tempted to go for where it's the worst and deal with that first, but really it's important when you're prioritizing your control efforts to focus on those outlying infestations, those ones that are at low densities right now, where you still have native vegetation growing actively around those infestations, because the reality is with invasive species control, as you would have heard with some of those species profiles I went over, they stay viable in the seed bank for a long time. They're extremely vigorous, so they take repeated control effort over years to control. By the time you would get that core area, the worst portion of that infestation controlled, those smaller satellite populations will have become more advanced and even worse than they were when you could have just controlled them on the outset when they were smaller infestations. So prioritize the outlying infestations first and work your way towards where it's the worst is the key takeaway with this slide. Because the native plant communities will help respond and help you in battling invasives on the landscape too. One important part of the strategizing that we do at the county is we'll utilize something called field maps. That's an ArcGIS Esri program. So we will map invasive species populations for each of our properties. So we document what the species is, where it is obviously on the map, and then take notes on the infestation level. So is this a really dense patch of garlic mustard, or is it just a couple plants that can be removed by some volunteers on a hand pulling day? This is a great tool. You don't need to use Esri field maps. You can use other platforms if you want to, or tools that you may come up with. But having a plan like this helps you with prioritizing where you're going to focus within a 200-acre property. Okay, we're going to focus on the garlic mustard where we know we have a lot of spring ephemeral wildflowers occurring. These are the outlier infestations versus the dense core mess of garlic mustard. So having this as a tool is really effective in planning control efforts. So just highlighting a couple of those control efforts too. Cut stump and basal cut stump are the most common control method that we use for woody invasive species control. So if we're going in with volunteers or our staff and we're cutting buckthorn or honeysuckle, this is what we're doing to effectively control the plants. So we'll cut stumps to about 4 inches. Or below that, but you don't want to cut it totally flush with the soil just to ensure the effectiveness of the herbicide. And then we place glyphosate or triclopyr around the edge of the stump. So that cambium, the living tissue where all the plumbing is for that tree or shrub, we place the chemical there, right on that outer section, because that will be taken down into the roots and systematically kill that plant. So you can use triclopyr amine or Garlon 3A, glyphosate mixed with water to apply to cut stump treatments, or you could use the triclopyr ester, which is Garlon 4, mixed with bark oil. This is super effective to do during the dormancy or after things have fully leafed out. So we do a lot of this in winter when there's not a ton of snow around the stumps because you don't want water interfering with your treatment. And you can do it in the middle of the growing season too. The key is to try to avoid it when plants are actively trying to grow. So in the spring when they're pushing water up out of the roots up into the leaves to get the leaves to grow, right? That's not the most effective period to do a cut stump treatment. Sometimes you even see that herbicide just kind of bubbling up right out of the stump. So avoid that window, that March, April window, but every other window within the life cycle should be effective. We'll do the creative things with the brush too. We'll burn the brush down. You can create wildlife brush piles. You can also do some natural fencing. This is a picture from Greenfield Park in Milwaukee. When I worked there, we created a natural fence leading up to a trailhead so that folks would stop creating rogue trails through the woods. Foliar spraying is often a control technique that we use for a lot of those herbaceous invasives that I discussed. So garlic mustard, Canada thistle. You can also foliar spray things like common buckthorn and honeysuckle too, but that's where we apply chemical to the actively photosynthesizing foliage or the leaves throughout the growing season, so June through October. We really only ever do this in areas of very dense vegetation, and it does involve lower concentrations of herbicide compared to when we're doing things with a cut stump treatment. Key to any use of herbicide for any of these species is to ensure that you're using surfactants. So this is something that allows the chemical to penetrate the leaves of very waxy species. So something like black swallowwort is particularly waxy. A surfactant just helps, one, hold the herbicide on a leaf, but then two, helps it penetrate through that waxy layer. We usually mix about, I think, a tablespoon per gallon when we're doing our tank mixtures. And this is just key. I would never mix anything really for foliar treatments without surfactant. No matter what we're treating, we're always using a surfactant, like an Alligator 90. When using herbicide, it's just very important to be cognizant of the fact that we're using it to kill invasive species, but and there can be very effective in restoring remnant ecosystems, but it's really important to remember that it can be very easy to do more damage than good if you're not using herbicides by the label and being, applying effectively, being aware of drift and weather conditions when you're spraying. So it's just so important to be very thoughtful when you're using them, especially when you're working in remnant plant communities, and consider that there may be other options in those situations too, if you have the resources and the time to be able to do them, such as hand pulling or cut stump treatments. You can think of other strategies to utilize to effectively control them. I also strongly recommend that everybody get their water tested because water hardness is particularly a problem in our region, and hard water can actually significantly impact the effectiveness of your herbicides. So essentially, we do tests through Helena. They do water tests for I think like $45, and you can add things to your tank mixtures to mitigate that so that the water hardness isn't affecting your tank mixtures. And I could talk about the science behind that later if there's a question on it, or I'll send that in an email. If you're going to be using herbicides for invasive plant control, while you're not required to all the time, depending on if you're for hire, you must, but like if you're a municipality or like us for county parks, you're not necessarily required to actually have your certification to apply chemicals. We just have internal policy that all our staff does, because this whole process of getting the certification ensures that you're informed on all of the current techniques and laws, as well as the safety mechanisms and measures that are in place. So I strongly recommend that anybody does this. It's only $50 to get your certification, and it's good for 5 years. Mowing is another control strategy that I mentioned. This is something that we'll do for things like wild parsnip or teasel. In dense stands of buckthorn, we will utilize our forestry mower, but it's key this time of year. We usually wait until mid-July to do that, especially if it's a large scale area, not just a right-of-way or a trail. We've got nesting birds at this time of year, so we try to be aware of that and time our mowings to not affect that. But usually if it's a highway right-of-way, or say a trailside right-of-way, or a narrow area that you're working on, the benefits of doing the mowing probably outweigh worrying about the other potential impacts, because at the end of the day, you're degrading bird habitat by allowing it to become a complete stand of wild parsnip anyway. So if mowing is the most effective measure, then you may just need to do it and take other measures to ensure bird protection at that site. Prescribed fire is a big tool that we utilize as well. So most of our ecosystems in this portion of the state evolve with prescribed fire on the landscape. It can be very effective in suppressing woody invasive species, mostly it's your friend and your best tool here because it invigorates your native species. So the native species can better compete in these situations when fire is on the landscape, as it would have been historically. Wrapping up here, restoration of the native vegetation is a key part of this. Sometimes that plant community that you're working on and managing invasives within or to restore, it will respond. If there's still remnant vegetation intact, or this native species intact there, maybe they'll start filling in. You'll start to see them spreading in a good way. But in some situations, that system has been so degraded for so long by invasives or other land use patterns, such as grazing or timber harvest, that you're going to have to do some work to restore the native plant community. So be prepared to think about what seed mixes would be appropriate and what and where you're going to get it and how to apply it within areas that you're managing. And always consider using native species in landscaping where and when you can. There's a lot of nurseries that now provide native stock or nativars at least. So prioritizing utilizing natives and diversifying those plantings is really important. You can, and I encourage you all to report invasive species. I had a few in this presentation that I said would be very important to share. If you see them or notice them, you can submit reports directly to the Wisconsin DNR. And you can also submit reports to EdMaps. This is kind of a citizen science or community-based reporting platform that the DNR does monitor too. But this is a nice way where you could check this out and see if people have reported invasive species on your property. And you can use this to map and track invasives on your lands too if you don't want to purchase a license for something like Esri Field Maps, for example. So check out EdMaps if you're interested in mapping and tracking invasives. For some of the roadway, if there's any roadway managers on today's program, SEWISC, our cooperative weed management area I mentioned earlier, years ago, they developed a really comprehensive roadside invasive management plan. So working with your local municipalities to at least inform them that there's a management plan out there that they could utilize to potentially help to time their mowing practices so that it benefits controlling invasives like wild parsnip or teasel. Those resources are out there. We also have, again, I'll bring us back to resources here. In the center there, the Midwest Invasive Plant Network is an online resource that you can utilize that provides a lot of information on control techniques for species. We utilize that to build out our control plans for specific invasives. They've got a lot of resources on what chemicals work best, how to mix them, what to mix them with, timing of application, as well as what other control methods exist for a species, whether that be grazing or mowing, and how effective they will be. So that's a fantastic resource for anybody that's interested in learning more on a species-specific control level, is the Midwest Invasive Plant Network. Also great to consider starting volunteer programs. There's a lot of invasives that you can control without the use of chemicals that volunteers are great for. We have hundreds of volunteers every year help us with invasive control in our parks. There's invasive plant management workshops coming up throughout this year, hosted by SEWISC. Those are all posted online, so you can sign up to attend one of those, and that's much more hands-on. Great thing to consider sending staff to if you're interested in doing more invasive management on the ground. And then every November, SEWISC hosts a free annual educational symposium with an invasive species related topic at Havenwood State Forest in Milwaukee. So this year, the topic's going to be Beyond Tanks and Gardens. So it's really going to talk about highlighting invasive species in the green industry. So that'll be something that'll be very interesting. And we usually attend every year. Our staff will attend this as well, but a great networking opportunity on this topic as well. So looks like I went literally with 1 minute left. So as I mentioned, big topic. My email is here. Happy to answer specific individual questions about things and provide more resources. But hopefully this provided you with at least like, I know I can go check that out now to learn more. So thank you for joining.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Julia. This was fascinating. And excuse me, for those of you who want to stick around, we'll do a little Q&A. If you have to go, I know we said we'd wrap up at 1. I will be sending the recording of this out to you. So, all right. So we do have a couple of questions, Julia. One was, you mentioned a good surfactant. Is that how you say that word? That's a new one for me. For buckthorn, that was used with the, oh my goodness, you should read this question yourself, with the triclopyr. Thank you. What surfactant is the best with that?
We've used Alligator 90. That's been our surfactant that we've used with most of our tank mixtures. There's other ones out there too, but that's been our go-to, has been Alligator 90. And I can try to remember to maybe send links to some of this potentially to you, Joanna, to send out, but that's been our go-to. There are several others on the market. It's just important to, when you're picking what you're going to use, we didn't dive into this, but certain chemicals are not approved for use in aquatic areas. So if you're managing or spraying plants in an area that's a wetland, you have to make sure you're using chemicals that are approved for use in aquatic areas. And that also goes for the surfactants. So just make sure you're double checking that. But the one that we will utilize is Alligator 90.
All right. And then another question. It has become kind of trendy for organizations to bring in like goats or sheep to help manage that invasive in an area. Is that something that you generally recommend?
I think it's a case by case basis thing. The county actually did bring in a goat herd before my time at Naga-Waukesha Park Golf Course. So where it can be really effective is the area severely degraded? So is there a lot of buckthorn that's of the right size and structure where goats can effectively graze it to stress the plants enough to kill it? If you put them in there and there's a lot of good native vegetation that you're trying to preserve, the goats don't know that they're going for buckthorn, right? They're indiscriminate. So it's not the best tool, in my opinion, when you're dealing with maybe a remnant ecosystem where there's still a lot of viable components of the native plant community still present. The other thing is it takes years. You need to be prepared to have goats rotating through that site for years. Putting goats into an area for 1 year, more often than not, isn't going to do the trick. You have to be prepared to invest in that for at least 3 years from what I've seen in the research. So it's a site case by case, I guess case by case basis, I would say whether or not it would be the right option.
Sure. Okay. Are there any other questions out there? But we'll give folks a chance if you want to type anything in, if you have any questions. But Julia is super responsive to anything, and her email address is right here. So feel free to reach out, to Julia with any questions if you're out and working on things and think of things later. And I will send out a follow-up email in the next day or two with the recording of this presentation, as well as any resources that Julia has for us. So
thank you so much.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone. All right. Thanks, Julia.
All right. Thank you.